If you wouldn't mind getting the recording started. Oh, we're good to go. Okay, cool. Let's go. Okay. I hope you guys are horrified by how many tabs I have open. This doesn't even cover half of it. You were near Chris and myself. In Florida or in Chicago? Probably I'm sorry, Florida, in New York City. Yeah, yes, I was just there very briefly. I couldn't have done anything because for quarantine purposes, I was literally just sort of say hi and bye. So, okay, last we left off, we started talking about meth. In fact, we kind of finished talking about meth. The last thing that we really fully discussed in detail was this concept of how difficult it is to quit meth. Because there's a lot of misinformation around meth in particular. It is possibly, as I said, the most stigmatized drug outside of PCP and heroin. Those big three are really notorious, as well as crack, but I would say even crack is less notorious than meth. This particular person, used meth for approximately 8 months and had dreams about it every night for 5 years. Now, this is actually a very common experience for people that are going through withdrawals from a particular drug that has a very powerful impact on the brain or body, particularly on the brain though, is having dreams about it, sometimes for months or years thereafter. This is a very common experience, and these dreams are often in the form of someone that has a dream that they've acquired it, they're about to do it, or they do it, and they're like, why would I stop this? And then they wake up, and it's a very emotional experience for the people going through it. Please remember to mute yourself. Thank you. It's often a very difficult experience for those that are going through it because it means that pretty much every day you wake up and you have to go through the emotional process of being like, did I actually do this? Like, I have to recommit myself to this process that I'm in right now. It's very difficult. So the safety profile of meth, this is probably not going to come as a huge surprise to many people, but there have been a lot of direct deaths from meth. Like it is a drug that is, I'll say that it has a much higher risk profile than other drugs. And the complication deaths from meth are usually in the form of, sleep deprivation and appetite reduction, because stimulants really reduce your ability to eat and sleep, right? But meth in particular lasts for quite a long time, depending on how you take it. It lasts for 8 to 12 hours if you eat it in pill form. People always laugh at me for saying eat it in reference to pills. I think that makes sense. Just don't chew them. I knew someone that told me that they chewed a rock of MDMA once because they thought it would absorb better. And technically speaking, it is breaking it down into smaller surface area in your stomach so it would hit you faster. But like, what the fuck? That sounds so disgusting. It's like MDMA tastes like licking battery acid. It's very gross. So it is possible to become moderately physically dependent on, apt description, thank you, on methamphetamine. It is a drug that can produce like withdrawals when you stop taking it, which is actually not the case for a lot of substances. Or if it is the case, it's mild. Things like cocaine, for instance, actually have a pretty low potential for physical dependence. Like your body isn't going to go through like heavy withdrawals in the same way that it might with meth, although it certainly is possible. The longer and more regularly you use a substance, the more likely you are to have some kind of withdrawal effects from it. So this scale is kind of like in proportion to other substances. How long and how much would you have to use it to experience these withdrawals? And meth is kind of like in the middle of that scale. But the psychological dependence and the addiction potentials of meth are very high. And like I said, this is probably not a major surprise to any of you, but it is true that methamphetamine is it is a drug that can cause dependence and addiction. Although I will say that addiction is largely a psychosocial model, and we'll go into that later. There is a neurological component to addiction. There is a psychological component to addiction. There is a behavioral and cultural component to addiction. There's an economic component to addiction. So when I say this has a high addiction potential, what I mean is that there are certain changes to brain chemistry that are made in the presence of certain drugs, and methamphetamine is a drug that is like, it has a higher propensity for causing those brain changes, in addition to everything else, right? So meth is the first stimulant that we're looking at that is neurotoxic. And that's why when people are like, oh, like I'm just about, like, I don't care if my Adderall's meth instead, like, that's fine, because on a subjective level, like I mentioned this last time, meth and Adderall have actually been rated as being very similar in terms of the experiences, but methamphetamine is known to be quite neurotoxic to dopamine neurons. So this is something, it's an issue of informed consent, right? Like if you eat meth in your press pill once or twice by accident, let's be real, most ravers have done this at some point in time, then you're not going to like destroy your brain, obviously. Like many of these things take time and repeat exposure and habits for them to really cause problems. However, this is a really important thing to keep in mind. Brain bleeding is a thing that can happen from stimulants like methamphetamine. And the reason that these brain bleeds happen is that when you have a lot of vasoconstriction, your blood vessels are tightening. That means that your blood is getting squeezed through your blood vessels at like a higher rate, basically, because your heart rate is going up, your blood pressure is going up. So if your blood vessels burst due to this pressure, it can cause bleeding into the surrounding area, which is a kind of stroke. It's hemorrhagic stroke. And hemorrhagic strokes can damage surrounding tissues. So this is a thing that can happen at just high doses of stimulants in general. But again, the more potent the stimulant, the more likely it is that this will happen. So methamphetamine has a higher risk of this just simply because of how potent it is at its recreational doses. Seizures are the result of excess brain activity, right? So similarly to other stimulants, if you have excess brain activity, especially if you're in an environment with a lot of stimulation, it can cause seizures. So this is something to look out for if you're combining this with other drugs that, for instance, lower your seizure threshold. This is a major thing that you need to look out for interactions with drugs, is with medications in particular, whether or not a substance is lowering your seizure threshold. Basically, whether that substance is making you more susceptible to seizures. So if you do a drug that also makes you more susceptible to seizures, that combination could induce a seizure. So with things like Molly, that's also really important to keep in mind, because MDMA also has a propensity for causing seizures by lowering your seizure threshold. So if you have a pressed pill with MDMA and methamphetamine in it, then that drastically increases your likelihood of having a seizure. Good to know for the ravers. And then there's Parkinson's-like symptoms, which we'll come back to in a second. The typical adulterants of meth, like usually meth is the adulterant, right? Like you're not going to buy a bag of meth and be like, oh no, it's Adderall. Like, I got the wrong thing. And usually no one's going to sell you MDMA instead of meth. That would be like extremely kind of them, I think. But just in terms of like, Molly's more expensive, you know what I mean? But these are two things that meth is very commonly used to adulterate. So you'll find methamphetamine in amphetamine, like in press pills, in fake Adderall, and in MDMA. And then there's also inert fillers that are used to adulterate methamphetamine. But most of the time, meth is a pretty cheap drug to make, right? Like you can make it in large oil barrels, and it's relatively easy to make, which is why it's so popular as a DIY substance. In fact, a lot of the region of the country that includes the Dakotas, what is that even called? Montana, Dakotas. It's not the Midwest. It's not the West Coast. Can anyone tell me what that region is officially known as? I feel like I look this up like 3 times a year. Anyone? Bueller? No. Okay. I'm on my own. That's fine. Bummer. So here's a question for you. Why is crystal meth Schedule 2 while crack is Schedule 1? Anyone have an idea here?
Because of racial inequality.
That's right. And we'll come back to that concept later. We'll look into exactly what has been implied here, including this thing called the Dark Alliance, which is basically allegations that were made in the 80s that the CIA intentionally planted crack as opposed to cocaine in low-income Black communities in the US so that they could be incriminated as part of the Iran-Contra scandal, which involved the import of cocaine and this whole web. But we'll get to it as soon as we're done with the spotlights in like a couple of weeks. We'll get around to what happened there. I do want to keep in mind also that, remember, crack cocaine is cocaine with baking soda added. That's it. You literally put the Coke in a spoon with some baking soda and some water, put a flame underneath it, and you have crack. That's it. That's the entire difference. That's it. But one of these is Schedule 1 and the other Schedule 2. And we'll come back to why. So just to compare these, because I know that upon looking at them, like I've said in the past, you might look at this row of stimulants and look at the neurotransmitters that I've described for them, et cetera, and be like, well, these seem like they would all just be the same drug. Like, what exactly is the difference between them? And they have mild differences in how they act, but a lot of it is in the doses and in the intensity of how they act. They have the same general systems of acting on neurotransmitters and the body, but some things are slightly different. For instance, how methamphetamine has properties that do make it neurotoxic to dopamine neurons. So amphetamine is frequently, it's the most widely used stimulant out of these for sure, because it's used in the form of Adderall, especially in recreational and productivity settings, but also in the form of amphetamine salt. And amphetamine salt or base is sold frequently in Europe as its own powder. Like, you're not even looking for Adderall, because Adderall is a little bit different than just straight up amphetamine. If you go to Europe, in a lot of places, you can be like, I want to buy some speed, and you can just buy powdered amphetamine itself. It doesn't even have to come in like a therapeutic form. And then there's methamphetamine, which has the highest potential for addiction out of all of these, and also is neurotoxic and produces the most intense rush of all of them, the most intense high. Coke is probably the second most widely used, I would say, after amphetamine, although methamphetamine is more widely used than people think. Cocaine is by far the most expensive here. If you think you have real cocaine, you probably don't. I'm just going to tell you that. I know I've said that before, but I cannot stress that enough. Your Coke is probably amphetamine, at least partly. Not a huge deal there, but like, just know that. Coke only lasts 45 to 60 minutes, right? It's a very short-lived high, and it also is known for causing fiending, this concept that even before you fully come up on the bump you've done, you want to take another bump. And that's something that Coke in particular, out of all drugs, is really, really known for. And then there's crack, which is the profiled version of Coke. Like, basically, that's it. It's the profiled version. It's the version that has been primarily used in lower income communities because it's cheaper. Like, let's say you can get a gram of Coke, and then from that, you can make like multiple grams of crack, because you're just adding baking soda to it. And each of those hits of crack hits you a lot harder. So you can smoke less and get just as high. And like, it's just more efficient, honestly. However, because it's so intense, crack also does have the potential to produce a more intense high that does make people feel more fiendy. So crack is known as being a very intense rush out of all of these. Now, I'm sure that many of you have seen images like this in the past as part of propaganda posters being like, this is you before and after meth. And the reason that images like this are so prevalent in terms of methamphetamine in particular, but also in terms of opioids, which we'll come back to when we do that spotlight, is this concept of people talking about delusional parasitosis, which is basically like, oh, you feel meth bugs, like you feel bugs under your skin. I'm sure, show me thumbs, how many of you have heard about the concept of meth bugs in the past? Oh, some of you. Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. But just like this concept, like, oh, if you do stimulants like meth, you're going to feel bugs crawling into your skin, right? Only on Chappelle. So there is some minor truth to this, which is that you can experience delusional parasitosis at, I just want to make sure I spelled that right. Parasitosis, yeah, I did. At higher doses of stimulants, especially more powerful stimulants, especially doing them more often. But what's more likely to cause these sores, because that's a huge media talking point, is like, if you do these stimulants, then you're going to feel bugs under your skin and scratch at them to try and get the bugs out. But more realistically, what's happening is that since your blood vessels are so dilated or so constricted from having to force all the blood through, you're getting less blood flow to your skin. So your skin is less capable of repairing itself. And that's what actually causes these sores most of the time. Although sometimes pruritus, remember, you can get skin picking and itching, just the sensation of itchiness that can happen with both opioids and stimulants. But often it's just that your skin is having a hard time repairing itself. Some other health hazards from smoking substances, because this is a very, very difficult one to get right due to like a whole bunch of health issues, is crack lip, which is basically, again, you have this pipe only a couple inches from your face. It gets super fucking hot. You are heating it up with a literal flame, like lighting these little rocks on fire from underneath and vaporizing it, and it can burn your lips. So if you have like, you can even see right here, this person has like a little bit of chap on their lip. Then there's crack meth and crack lung. This is a really common phrase that's used to refer to the lung diseases that can cause from harsh smoke. And I should stop and reiterate that these kinds of harsh lung diseases can come from anything that's producing smoke. You know what I mean? Like, some things will be more caustic on your lungs than others, obviously. But it is good to keep in mind that smoking anything, including weed, puts you at risk of lung disease. So be aware of that, smokers, during COVID right now, because in case you weren't already aware, even though cannabis is shown to have some immunoprotectant effects, it also often requires smoking it, which does irritate your lung lining and make you more prone to things like bronchitis and pneumonia, and make you more prone to complications from COVID. So this is a really good time to switch over to edibles or even dabbing if you're smoking weed right now, just in case you guys didn't know that. Then there's saliva. You're sharing pipes, which is really common. Sometimes it's hard to avoid. You got spit on it. It's going to go to other people. You can share a lot of diseases that way. Now let's circle back around to Parkinson's, because I know that I mentioned Parkinson's at a few points in the past, but let's talk about what exactly this has to do with stimulants. So normally you have motor control that's influenced by dopamine, right? And wait, does dabbing not stress out the lungs? Not as much as smoking, by a lot. If you're taking huge dabs, then obviously that's hard. Like, this is kind of a common sense thing with dabbing, I would say, because a lot of people take huge dabs, like 0.1 dabs or whatever it is they're doing, and just like hitting them hot and doing them all at once. If you do a smaller low temp dab, it's going to be better for your lungs, especially if you've iced it and have a perk and whatever. Wait, no, that's bomb. But what am I talking about? But generally speaking, smoking out of a pipe is the harshest for your lungs. Out of a bong is second harshest, then dabbing, and then edibles, obviously. So like, and also things like Magic Flight are even less so than dabbing, like vaporizing. I highly recommend like moving away from smoking if possible during this time. So normally your dopamine neurons are responsible at least partly for your motor control, right? And normally you have like a normal influx of dopamine neurons. They can bind with the receptors and do their thing. You have normal movement. But if you are using something like methamphetamine, and meth is really the main one that we see these symptoms with because of how potent it is, because you are constantly dumping dopamine into the synapse, right? Like, it is hitting that button, it is dumping dopamine, it is making dopamine do its thing. Because your brain is like, oh fuck, like I keep making all this dopamine and then it's gone immediately, it just gets used up. Your brain becomes more stingy with making dopamine, right? Like, it releases less of it, it produces less of it, and you just have less of it because you're using it so frequently and your body's trying to protect yourself. Because it's like, well, if I have like 10 dopamines and they all get released at once, then I'm going to have 10 dopamines worth of action, and that's a lot. So if I only make 3 dopamines, this is not science, just in case you were wondering, then they all get released at once, and it's going to like not put me into this overdrive mode. It's going to be more biologically sustainable. So as a result of this, you're just going to have a lower level of baseline dopamine release and production, which means that you're going to be more prone to movement disorders because you're going to have less. Are those percents defined by sex equals 100%? Oh, that's hilarious. This is not this. I was going to come back to this graph in a second. You can ice your dabs too. It helps. Yes, absolutely. Anything to cool down the smoke before you enter your lungs is good. Just like generally speaking, try and reduce the smoking. But yeah, in terms of movement disorders, you're making less dopamine, you're using less dopamine, ergo, you're getting less motor control. So this is a consequence of heavy chronic stimulant use, and it's very much more prominent in methamphetamine use because that tends to be more chronic and more high dose, but it can happen with any stimulant, really. This dopamine levels chart is intended pure, like this, don't go around quoting this being like, did you know that methamphetamine releases 1200% of your dopamine? This is exclusively just like a kind of ballpark ratios, just to give you an idea. And this is not like, don't go around showing this graph to people being like, this is the big thing, like this is the definitive science right here. But it is good to keep in mind that on a comparative scale, cocaine is very fucking potent. Like, people really underestimate coke, which is why it tends to claim so many people and be so fiendy, is because people underestimate that cocaine is a highly addictive substance. It is very much so. It is approximately as much so as other much more stigmatized highly addictive substances. It's just become cool in party settings. So please be mindful of that and be mindful of the privilege that comes with doing cocaine, especially after we talk about the cocaine trade route later. But methamphetamine is a whole different animal in terms of how potent it is and how heavy of a releasing agent it is. Now we're getting kind of up here in terms of the safety profile. And I do want to point out our little friend down on the end here, alcohol, is still the highest relative risk out of all of these substances. But let's look at stimulants regardless, right? All of the stimulants that we've talked about are ranked at the highest level of the respective harm scale. Like, stimulants, I think, are a very underestimated class of substances because they're not opioids. The fact of the matter is that stimulants do have the potential to cause pretty serious problems with your brain and body if you are using them irresponsibly. This is the case for all drugs. However, the risk level is slightly higher with stimulants, especially with stimulants that tend to come on in a faster rush. So remember, your route of administration with stimulants is actually a very important dictating point in the intensity of your experience and with the likelihood that it will become problematic. So if you're really dead set on trying a new stimulant, see if there's a way that you can ingest it without going to a route such as smoking. And I know that a lot of people would be like, I would never smoke crack. But at the end of the day, it's just another route of administration. And snorting is more intense than putting it up your butt, is more intense than eating it. So, like, do some research and try and find a way to minimize the risks if you choose to do these substances. So even with something like Coke, right, like it has a higher dependence potential and it has a higher active and lethal dose, right? Like this ratio, the active dose to lethal dose, basically means how much of this substance would you need to ingest to have a 50-50 chance of dying. That's called the LD50. And the higher the LD50 is, is it the higher the LD50 is? I think it's the lower the LD50 is, which means the lower the dose that you would need to have a 50-50 chance of dying, the worse off the safety profile of this is. So I just want to reiterate this fact that a lot of people don't consider cocaine to be a dangerous substance. And while I don't use the word dangerous lightly in this course, I do want to point out that something like Coke should not be taken lightly. It remains to be a very intense drug. And doing lines of it can really, really impact a person's like psychosomatic condition. So just be aware of that. Okay, in terms of, I don't know what this guy's doing over here, but he's around. So in terms of sharing snorting devices, you can get Hep C and you can also get HIV from sharing snorting devices. There was a study a couple of years ago that showed some egregiously high percentage of all dollar bills in circulation have both cocaine and blood on them. In case you weren't aware of this, when you snort something, you get tiny little microscopic cuts in your sinuses, which produce little tiny microscopic drops of blood, which are then on that surface. And if you are snorting something else using that same straw, you could get HIV from that. It is not likely that you'll get HIV from sharing a snorting device, but it is possible. The Hep C thing, though, is super possible and happens all the time. So please be aware of this. If you need, grab the nearest piece of paper like a Post-it note, tear off a piece of it, roll it up into a little personalized straw, and then throw it away. It's not as glamorous as using a $45, oh my god, I almost just said a $45 bill. What in the fuck? Anyway, oh, that's what this guy was doing here. Meth and MAOIs do not mix. LOL. Thanks, Vanessa. Meth and MAOIs don't mix. This is because of the serotonin release that takes place. Like, please be careful of MAOIs with most drugs. They have a lot of interactions. If you're going to be sharing pipes, make sure to sanitize them beforehand to get any potential pathogens off of the pipe itself. Taking vitamins before doing stimulants, especially if you have a feeling you're going to be doing a lot of stimulants for a long time, is a really good idea because often you don't eat enough. And if you're not taking care of your physiological needs by sleeping, which, let's be real, if you're trying to stay up for all 3 days of a festival and taking a bunch of amphetamines and doing coke, then you're realistically probably going to need to pick up the slack in other areas to compensate. Hydration, super important on all drugs, but especially stimulants, because since you're raising your CNS properties so much during these times that you're on them, you're going to be sweating things out more, losing more body water, more body water. Oh my God. Rip, guys. And also, you're going to be probably exerting more energy, right? Just from existing. So you need to like make sure to take some vitamins before you do this, especially if you think it's going to be a longer thing. Always going to say start small, start low, go slow. And we're going to take some time to come back and talk about psychosis later and stimulant psychosis. And we'll talk about how to identify stimulant psychosis as well. A lot of the times, if you have friends that are just like acting weird, and you notice that they've been posting a lot on social media or being like kind of frantic about making plans, that might be indicative of some kind of like psychotic episode or manic episode or both. And psychosis can totally happen from stimulants, especially and primarily when someone hasn't slept. Usually I would say 3 days, no sleep, is when you are pretty much guaranteed to have some kind of psychotic experience. And let's work on destigmatizing psychosis, right? Like psychosis is actually a very common experience that's had by people. Very common. There's no shame in having a psychotic episode. You know, like sometimes it happens. It can happen just from stress. Like really, psychosis can happen just from high stress. It happens to all kinds of people from all walks of life. So when we talk about psychosis, let's make sure that we're not talking about it in the guise of like, oh, someone is like detached from reality and scary, but more that someone's having a mental health episode, and it will probably be acute and go away at some point. And if it doesn't, then that's part of their mental health, and there's still a person that deserves love and care. So let's normalize psychosis being an okay thing. What happens if someone mixed meth and an MAOI? It puts you at higher risk of serotonin syndrome because MAOIs have such a heavy action on serotonin because they prevent it from getting sucked up and cleaned up, right? So there's just a lot of serotonin, and all of these major stimulants act on serotonin as well. So it is more likely that you have a serotonin syndrome from combining it with meth because it's so much more powerful of a stimulant than with other things. But you shouldn't combine an MAOI with most things, honestly. I also want to clean up a prior note that I'd put out about microdosing and bipolar. I think that in the email that I sent out, I was a little bit too lax with my language, and also want to reiterate the point that, like, at the end of the day, your primary point of contact for doing something like this should always be your prescribing physician, because they need to be in the loop about what you're doing. And it could cause a lot of problems if you're not truthful with them about what you're doing for one reason or another. So please just like keep that in mind if you have bipolar and you're looking into doing psychedelics. Like, make sure that you are paying very close attention to what is going to work for you specifically, because that can vary. Now let's talk about dissociatives. Woo-woo. Stoked for dissociatives, baby. Okay, all right. So let's just quick recap. What are the least to most potent amphetamine type stimulants? And ATS, amphetamine type stimulant, just like encapsulates a lot of the major stimulants. What is the least to most? 3 of them. We're just doing 3 of them right now. I have so much faith.
Guessing Adderall might be the least.
Yep, that's right. Then what?
Okay.
That's right. And then the most potent?
Methamphetamine.
Methamphetamine, that's right. So we have amphetamine / Adderall, similar, not quite the same. Cocaine, then crack cocaine just because of its form, and methamphetamine. Comment about cocaine. It is a TRI or triple reuptake inhibitor. It is a particularly dangerous drug to take because serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine can all become dangerous, especially if you're on an SSRI or taking Molly that dumps serotonin. Sorry, it took me a long time to get to the chat. That's okay, but I also want to point out that all of those stimulants are TRIs. All of them are. Major stimulants, just in general, are what are called SNDRIs, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake inhibitor. So that means that each of them is going to have a varying degree to which it is a reuptake inhibitor versus a releasing agent. So it can be both. Remember, it can reuptake inhibit, which prevents it from getting recycled, or it can be a releasing agent, which dumps it. So they're different things, right? Like if something is more of a reuptake inhibitor than a releasing agent, it's probably going to be a little bit less potent than if it were more of a releasing agent and less of a reuptake inhibitor. So it is true that it is particularly dangerous to combine any stimulant, especially at like higher levels, with like specifically at higher levels, actually, I would say. Like it is not uncommon to be prescribed like an SSRI and be able to take Adderall on top of it. It simply makes you more simply makes you more prone to complications. But yeah, and the SSRI thing, remember that the true danger of mixing SSRIs and MDMA is, yes, we've talked about cocaethylene, yeah. The true danger of combining SSRIs and MDMA, does anyone remember what it is? Pop quiz.
Serotonin syndrome?
Parkinson syndrome.
That's a really good guess. And like that is on the table as being a risk. But remember we talked about the distinction between the danger of taking an MAOI and MDMA versus an SSRI and MDMA, and how an MAOI is so much more dangerous. And the reason is that, remember that an SSRI is a competitive reuptake inhibitor. So that means that when it's trying to jam itself into that transporter, when it's trying to stick itself in there and prevent stuff from getting sucked back in, if MDMA wanders along, because for Molly to work, it has to get sucked in through the transporters, right? But if something's already in there, the MDMA is going to be like, hello. So it's just not going to work. And the toxic metabolites and byproducts from MDMA will still probably cause some small level of harm to your body. And like, so it's still not a good idea to take MDMA and SSRIs, because you're just not going to roll for the most part, but you're still going to have the negative effects. But it's actually not quite as dangerous as people think if you're taking a normal dose, because you're just not going to roll. So you're not really at risk of serotonin syndrome in the same. It's quite rare for people to get serotonin syndrome from lower doses of MDMA mixed with SSRIs. Yes. Whoops. What are the 3 major neurotransmitters that are acted on by stimulants? We just talked about this.
Serotonin, dopamine, and epinephrine.
Yes, exactly. Virtual high five. Nice. So dopamine is probably the most prominent that stimulants will act on. Serotonin and norepinephrine are also acted on by major stimulants. But dopamine is really the defining factor here. Which major stimulant is neurotoxic? Should be an easy one. Meth, yes. Meth, lol. What are some reasons why a chronic amphetamine type stimulant user may have sores or welts?
Vasoconstriction?
Yes, exactly. Vasoconstriction, reduced blood flow. What is parachuting? Do you remember this one?
When you put the substance in toilet paper and ingest.
Yes. Make sure to only use 1-ply toilet paper, folks. Not 2-ply. It gets real messy otherwise. What is an SNDRI? We've already just talked about this one. It's a serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Now, an example of a prescription SNDRI might be something like efresher. And it's actually been shown that SNDRIs might be more effective at treating depression than traditional SSRIs. What are those? Starts with a T. What was that?
Tutors.
Tutors. Yeah. So tutors, snorting devices. Anyone remember the word for repetitive obsessive action that can come from some chronic stimulant users? Like they have to, this is like a pretty late stage thing. Starts with a P. I'd be surprised if anyone remembered it. I didn't think so. This is punding. We're going a little bit slower in this course because I've had to take time off. This is punding. This is also a symptom of Parkinson's disease. So remember that these two things can be conflated sometimes. And what is this pipe called? What is 2 words that we can use for this pipe? Both start with a P.
Pookie.
Pookie. I love how excited whoever that was. And pizzo is the other one. Pookie and pizzo are 2 words for it. All right, so dissociation, for those of you that are not familiar with dissociation, which would shock me if you aren't, because I feel like everyone's dissociated during quarantine, is a feeling of separation or disconnectedness, either from the self or from the environment. So dissociatives are drugs that induce this intentionally. So major effect of dissociatives is analgesia, pain relief. This is actually the primary thing that happens from dissociatives, like if they're used as intended, which they're usually not. And then sedation and tranquilization is also a part of this, and depressant-like effects. Although it's true that dissociatives are not as depressant-like as solid depressants or opioids. Like they're not quite as depressant as those two are, although they're frequently used in conjunction with both of those kinds of drugs to sedate people for surgery. Many are anesthetic. Yeah, they are anesthetics. That's analgesia, is pain relief. The general effects of dissociatives are depersonalization or derealization, which is disconnect either from yourself or from your environment. And these are 2 kind of distinct flavors of dissociation that tend to vary from person to person. Oftentimes, dissociatives cause an out-of-body experience, right? And then hallucinations can happen. Most of the time, this will happen in the form of like at really high doses, there might be some visual warping, like a little bit, often like darker and kind of greener than traditional psychedelics. But also, depending on which dissociative you're using, there could be very profound closed eye kind of tunneling experiences that aren't necessarily similar to traditional psychedelics, because they often are actually in the form of like memory flashes. And this depends on the certain dissociative that you're doing. Like the more, I would say, analogy dissociatives might be more prone to inducing these kind of thought tunnels where you start thinking about a subject and then it just kind of like unravels, it just unfolds, kind of like that sensation right before you're falling asleep where you don't really have control over your inner monologue. Depending on the kind of dissociative it is, that can happen sometimes. Then trance-like states are what dissociatives are known for in party settings, right? Like feelings of floatiness. Ketamine is often likened to being a little bit like being drunk physically without the sensation of like mental cloudiness and like a euphoric apathy or like an apathetic euphoria more specifically. So dissociatives are really the ultimate crossroads of the different categories that we've talked about because they contain elements of different kinds of drugs that give them a super unique profile. Like dissociatives are a weird little bird. They're a strange category of drugs. So ketamine, PCP, alcohol, and DXM share properties with depressants and opioids. And what am I looking at? Depressants and opioids. Nitrous oxide is also an inhalant, so it has multiple different kinds of properties that come with inhalants specifically as a class as well. So for instance, the risk of hypoxia, which is a loss of oxygen flow if you hold it in for too long or are doing too many in a row. And B12 depletion can happen from something like nitrous that wouldn't happen from something like ketamine for the most part. And ketamine has, and PCP and DXM, I'm not sure where I put alcohol in here, I forgot. But ketamine and DXM and PCP all have depressant-like effects as well. So it is important to note that having different properties of different categories is a common thing between substances, and it's kind of just like a balance, a proportional balance of which properties are more expressed in a specific drug. So like, I would say that DXM has more depressant-like properties than ketamine does. And ketamine has more opioid-like properties than DXM does from a subjective standpoint. Now, initially, the government was looking at psychedelics and was like, how can we induce psychosis in people to make them do what we want? And this was part of an experiment called the Manchurian Candidate, which we'll come back to in greater detail later. I bet some of you are familiar with that already. But it was their goal to be like, how can we program someone to kill people for us and not care and then forget? So they were like, let's look into like chemically induced psychosis. And initially, they were like, psychedelics should do this. This sounds like a thing right up psychedelics alley. But then they started doing experiments with dissociatives instead, and they're like, oh, dissociatives are actually much more likely to induce a psychosis-like state. So this is an interesting thing that we've discovered, that even though a lot of the behaviors that are exhibited under the influence of psychedelics are very similar to those that are exhibited in psychosis, it remains the truth that dissociatives are actually more likely to induce psychosis than psychedelics are. Do you know how often someone who uses nitrous heavily should take B12, or any idea if it's more effective depending on when you take it relative to nitrous? That's a really good question. I do think it depends not only on how well stocked you are with B12 in general, but how frequently you're doing nitrous and how much nitrous you're doing. You should always take nitrous you should always take B12 before you do nitrous. It's not going to really do anything for you if you take it during or after, except for some minor damage control effects. Because the problem with taking nitrous or doing nitrous on like a heavy recreational consistent basis is that B12 depletion can have a lot of kind of like weird consequences that we don't really think about, that range from like nerve pain and neuropathy to organ damage. So people that are B12 deficient often don't even realize it because it has so many symptoms. So I would say it's not a bad call if you're doing nitrous ever to just take a B complex like the day of even or the day before. I can't tell you with certainty when the timeline would be most effective, but I would imagine as long as it has a couple of hours to do its thing, that might be okay. But I really would just recommend like supplementing B vitamins if you're nervous about it within a couple of days. Yeah, B12 is a water soluble, so there's no danger of taking excess because it will dissolve into waters and be filtered by your kidneys. I don't know. I can't fact check that off the top of my head, but I would say that B12 is one of the safer things to supplement. I don't think that you need to take too much in excess. Like you should just take the allocated dose on the bottle and it's probably okay. I can tell you that B12 affects your urine color. Yeah. And yeah, I think that B complex, you shouldn't take excess of it because it, like, even having too much of any vitamin is still going to be bad for you. You know what I mean? And it is true that people do take too much of vitamins frequently and have complications, especially because they can have kind of subtle effects on your other organs. It's true that you're going to piss Gatorade though. Like it's like radioactive horse piss. It's really scary looking. So don't be afraid if your pee smells like B vitamins and is bright, zesty lemon yellow. So in terms of the like overarching dissociative chemistry, right? We've talked about this before. It's fun to party with NMDA. Wish I could have you all in a room and make you do this on the chairs. But this is the specific glutamate receptor that major dissociatives bind to. This is the GOAT right here. This is the guy. So PCP and nitrous and DXM and ketamine all are NMDA receptor antagonists. They reduce the effectiveness of glutamate. This is the main shebang for dissociatives, the main thing that they do. So primarily, right, because we decided to go pirate theme on this slide 2 years ago, I guess, the main thing that they do is reduce the effectiveness of glutamate. They reduce glutamate activity. And remember that glutamate is responsible for learning and memory and excitation, like making neurons communicate with each other more effectively. So if you're reducing all of those things, you're going to have less memory, you're going to have less communication between neurons, which can facilitate in pain reduction and also in sedation. And then we're going to have an increase in the activity of GABA, opioids, and dopamine. So this is a complicated effects profile, right? Like this is a lot of shit happening at the same time. But we see here that if we're increasing the effects of GABA and opioids, we're going to have some of that depressant effect. We're going to have some of that pain relief and sedation effect. And by decreasing glutamate, we also leave the door a little bit open for psychedelic experiences. Why, one might ask? Well, one theory behind this, and this is still in its theory territory, but a cool one nonetheless, is that when you decrease the amount of communication that your brain is having about what's going on with it and its environment, it fills in the blanks. It basically looks at this slate that is no longer quite as full and puts information into it. So that's one theory as to why, for instance, we saw that like certain psychedelics may have some activity with glutamate. This is an interesting theory, right, of like the potential for reducing, like filtering our environment and putting in more information in the meantime. But that could be completely not relevant for this at all. So just something that you want to think about just for fun. So just a quick refresher for neurotransmitters, because I know that we kind of like blew through that section and moved on. Remember that dopamine is for reward and mood and motor control. It is involved in goal seeking, like goal seeking. You want to do a thing and you feel good about doing a thing. And this is primarily seen in stimulants and just a little bit in psychedelics as a very secondary kind of deal to the main shebang that psychedelics do. Norepinephrine is your energy, your fight or flight. And this is predominantly found in stimulants above anything else. Like if it acts on norepinephrine, it probably has some kind of stimulant activity. Serotonin is primarily involved in your emotion, your perception of the world around you. And the word perception is really important here because remember that even though MDMA doesn't have the same kind of psychedelic effects that psychedelics do necessarily, or like to the same extent, it still alters your perception of the world around you. So that's a really important thing to note, is that perception is the key word in terms of serotonin. And this is primarily, I'm sorry for these notifications if they keep happening, I'll turn it off. For psychedelics and MDMA-like drugs. Then there's glutamate, which is the excitatory neurotransmitter. It facilitates communication between the brain and body and the brain itself. It is involved in learning and memory, and it is primarily affected by dissociatives, right? So dissociatives disrupt this process, okay? Dissociatives disrupt, dissociatives disrupt, dissociatives disrupt. As opposed to GABA, which is enhanced by depressants, okay? Important distinction to make. Dissociatives disrupt, depressants enhance. So GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It slows down the system. Depressants enhance its activity. Now, a lot of these dissociatives originate in medical contexts, right? Like this is ketamine hydrochloride, right? And they're predominantly used for anesthesia and used in conjunction with other things for sedation purposes. So oftentimes you will go under and you'll get like ketamine and propofol or fentanyl, and these drugs work together. That's why anesthesiologists get paid so fucking much, because they have to give you the right combination of drugs that you don't die during surgery. And then there's partying and recreational purposes. Pop quiz, what's in the balloon?
Nitrous.
Nitrous, exactly. And then for therapeutic purposes as well, a lot of these dissociatives have gained like popularity in recent years for their antidepressant qualities, particularly ketamine, and their anxiolytic properties, their anti-anxiety qualities. Now, mental illness is kind of a complicated one here still right now, because it is true that since dissociatives induce states that are more like psychotic states than most other drugs, if you are prone to psychotic disorders, such as schizophrenia or schizotypal or schizoaffective, whatever, you might be more prone to having complications with your existing mental health condition from dissociatives. A very important thing to keep in mind. And then with depression, this really depends on the specific dissociative. This is not something that we can apply to all dissociatives because they're not all created equal in this way. Like ketamine has a lot of promise in this field. Something like nitrous, not really. Like, what are you going to do? Like pop 2 nitrous in the morning and just go to work? You get like 45 seconds of being high and then you come down and you're like still depressed. I don't think it's going to work that way. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe nitrous will end up being the miracle drug of the century. That'd be wild. Now, I'm not sure why this has Shrek on it. So some interactions with dissociatives, the biggest one I would say is dissociatives and depressants. This shit don't mix. It just does not go well. Just trust me. Most dissociatives, since they have depressant-like and opioid-like qualities, if you combine them with depressants, you're going to drastically reduce heart rate and blood pressure in most cases, which can be very dangerous. This can also induce vomiting, especially if you're combining with alcohol, which can cause a person to choke on their own puke and die. And this is more common than one might think. If you see someone that is passed out on the ground, roll them onto their left side, and I'll show you how to do the recovery position later in the course after the spotlights. This is a great thing for my first responders in here. Is this some of the dangers of taking lean? Yes. Well, lean is an opioid. Lean is codeine. And people don't really think about that, but like it's an opioid. So if you combine an opioid with a dissociative, you are very much at risk of someone's heart rate and blood pressure dropping to very dangerous levels. But also, even if you're just taking like small quantities of both, they compound the effects of each other. So someone that may have been like a little bit drunk who does a bump of ketamine, for instance, even if they're just a little drunk and they do a bump of K, they could be like sloppy, staggering, puking, like the works. Like ketamine and alcohol, super notorious combination, because often someone will already be drunk and they'll just be like, yeah, I have a bump. And then they have like an hour and a half of crazy psychedelic spin time, and it might be a medical emergency if they're drunk enough. So this combination is a really dangerous one that's very common in festival settings. Let's talk about ketamine. Yeah. So ketamine is colloquially known as kitty kitty, or special K is less common. Like no one's like, hello, I would like to purchase some special K. They just call it K, or ketamine, or ket, or kitty, or meow, which can be kind of bad because also methadone is known as meow meow. So like use your slang carefully. When in doubt, just say the name of the damn drug. Like you don't want to have that mix up. You know, like I know someone that accidentally bought meth when they were trying to buy Adderall because they asked for speed. Like it just happens sometimes. Just say the name of the drug that you want. An approximate dose of ketamine is 30 to 75 milligrams, although in recreational settings it is frequently a lot less than 30 milligrams. Can DXM come in non-liquid forms? Yes, it is. Also, I mean, it's NyQuil, you know, like if you get those little capsules of NyQuil pills, I don't know if all of them actually have DXM in them, but I believe that the nighttime ones do have DXM in them because it's a cough suppressant. Yeah, it's not something that's really on the black market. I'm sorry, the illicit market. So oftentimes the standard dose of recreational ketamine will only be between 10 and 20 milligrams. Like that's enough usually to get you past threshold. And if you go higher than that, you run the risk of becoming more immobilized because you are effectively anesthetizing yourself the higher dose you go with many dissociatives. And this can be a blessing and a curse. Like I said before, I know someone who headbanged so hard on ketamine that she had to go to the ER twice for spraining her chest. So, like, yeah, you can self-anesthetize totally inadvertently. It's a thing that can happen. Be careful of that. There's this thing called the K-hole that we'll get back to in a second. But most of the time, if someone's just like on ketamine. They're just K'd out. You know, sometimes there'll be like other regional slang for it, but I'm not aware of any. Most of the time it comes in powder form. In some cases you can get it in liquid form. When ketamine is made, it's a rock, and then it is broken, and then it's a crystal, and then it's dissolved in saline solution, and then it's liquid. And then if you buy a vial of liquid, you can pour the liquid into like a Pyrex dish and either put it in a double boiler on the stove and let the water evaporate off, or if you're feeling ballsy, stick it in the oven or the microwave, or just let the saline or water evaporate out, and then you're left with this crystal or this like kind of beautiful like salty coating that you just like push up with a card or something or a razor blade and chop up to make it fine. Then you have powder again. The appeal with this is that if you can get sealed medical grade vials of ketamine, then you know exactly what's in it because it's medical grade, right? And usually, in fact, pretty rarely, if ever, will medical grade ketamine be sold in non-liquid form because it's used intravenously in medicine, right? So if you do get powder on the streets, it leaves just like a really high likelihood of that powder having been cut, right? And real ketamine is getting harder and harder to find in the US, and it's very expensive in the US. It's between $80 and $100 per gram, which is around like, I would say like maybe 30 bumps, approximately, maybe a little less than that. So that's only like a couple nights of partying, you know. Now, when you snort it, it takes about 5 to 15 minutes to come up. So a cardinal sin with ketamine is waiting 4 minutes after your prior bump, being like, I don't feel it, and taking another bump. And then 15 minutes later, you don't know whether or not you're in the country that you started out in. This is a true story. I have witnessed it in the past. It only lasts like 45 to 60 minutes, which makes it a very popular alternative to alcohol, because after an hour and a half, you are like sober. Although you still do have a little bit of that like residual dissociative effect. Like you should wait like 2.5 hours before you drive, but you technically are like, if you do a small quantity of K, then after an hour and a half, you're like sober most of the time. It's rare that you would not be. I don't know why you wouldn't be. If it takes you longer than an hour and a half to be completely sober, you were not doing ketamine. Even if you did a huge amount of it, you'll be sober after an hour and a half, which is great, because if someone does the thing where they get drunk and then they do a bump and they're really fucked up, they're only fucked up for an hour and a half and then they're just like sober again. It's really weird to watch sometimes, actually. Someone will be like passed out with puke in their beard, like mumbling incoherently and flailing. And then like 20 minutes goes by and they sit up, bolt upright, completely alert. And they're like, can I have some water? It's really weird. And then sometimes you can IM it. Like this is just, or IV it. It's not as common for people to inject ketamine, but it is a very popular route for people that don't want to damage their nasal cavities, who have the proper gear. Like if you're gonna be like a long-term user of ketamine, this is a safer way to do it in a lot of respects, honestly, than snorting, because snorting it can cause deviated sinuses and damage to your nasal passageways. What about racemic versus S-isomer? Okay, so ketamine is a drug that has 2 isomers, basically 2 molecular additions to it. There's R isomer, or the racemic isomer, which is just like a science term we won't get into. And then there's S isomer. So R and S are the 2 different kinds of ketamine. And they're each being studied for different purposes. And I wish I could remember directly off the top of my head which is being used for what, but they're both being studied for which of them is more effective at treating depression and which of them is more effective as a sedative. From what I can remember, S isomer is traditionally considered to be like more potent and more psychedelic, and longer lasting, but not as effective for treating depression. And R isomer is less potent, less psychedelic, and shorter lasting, or maybe it's the other way around on that duration, but less potent for treating depression. So it kind of is like dependent on what your goal is with them. Yeah, well, yeah, GHB is primarily GABAergic. It has, yeah, it's just another drug that has crossover, right? Like a lot of depressant drugs have dissociative traits and vice versa. Now, as with other dissociatives, right, this is primarily a drug that's going to reduce the effectiveness of glutamate, reduce the discussion between brain and brain and brain and body, increase the effectiveness of GABA, increase the effectiveness of opioid systems in your brain. But ketamine is like all glutamate, baby. It's like 15 times more active at glutamate than other receptors, which means that it's not going to be quite as drowsy as other dissociatives are. Like other dissociatives do make you sleepier and more sedated or have like other effects in that realm, but it's primarily for interrupting pain signals. But weirdly enough, ketamine also activates your fight or flight system, which may explain why it's not quite as sedating in party settings as other dissociatives are. We have a couple more minutes. So the main physical effect of ketamine is this feeling of like lightness and floatiness. It is very much similar to being drunk in a lot of ways because of this sensation of lightness and springiness, and also just like a lack of sensation. But it can also be a very pleasantly tactile drug. Ketamine is a tailored drug to dance on in rave communities. Like that's just what it's used for in a lot of cases. And it also can be a social lubricant for some people, only some people. Like some people don't find ketamine to be a social lubricant. Others find it very much so. At higher doses, it's very much not so, I would say. Good for poi too. Yeah, it's a very tactile substance, which is interesting because it reduces pain signaling. So the touch that you do get while it's not sensitized is very pleasant. And then also can have some mild visuals, but it's primarily closed eye visuals. Let's take a look at David Guetta. Hi at Tomorrowland. Look at this guy. Anyway, that's David Guetta. I don't remember exactly. I'm pretty sure that it was actually like confirmed that he was on K at this time, but I'm not positive. I'm pretty sure. And then the last thing we'll look at real quick is this guy on ketamine attempting to climb a hill. There he goes. Off. There he goes. And, oh. And he's coming back around. Anyway, so ketamine can do some things to motor control. All right. Thanks for coming. I'm so sorry about last time on Tuesday. I feel really bad that people were here. Visuals for ketamine are underrated. It makes it hard to estimate sizes of stuff. Yeah, ketamine visuals can get weird. Talia, you can stop recording.